What is going on, my friend? Welcome back to day 4 of your free course of how to implement the principles that we talk about in the Athlete's Guide to Nutritional Periodization. Hopefully you're enjoying the book so far. Hopefully you're enjoying this course so far. And today we're going to talk about carbohydrates and fat. One of the most common mistakes I see athletes make is under-consuming carbohydrates. And that can be the worst thing that you do as an athlete because carbohydrates are literally your fuel for high intensity activity. They're your body's primary preferred fuel source for high intensity modalities of training and exercise. And they're stored in your muscle, carbs are stored in your muscles as glycogen. And that is what your body uses during high intensity activities. So if you're playing a team sport like basketball, football, soccer, your body's likely using carbs during that match or during that practice, during that game. If you're doing something like CrossFit, you're definitely using a ton of carbs. And one of the worst things you could do as an athlete is under-eat carbs. So today we're gonna make sure that you're not doing that. And also fats are very, very important for other health reasons like maintaining proper hormonal health, managing inflammation, and supporting nervous system health, which are all very, very important things as an athlete. So we don't want to neglect fat either. We need to make sure that your balance of carbs to fats is on point so you can maximize your performance, you can maximize your health, and all that good stuff, and make sure you're achieving your true athletic potential. So how many carbs, as always, how many carbs and fats you should be eating per day is going to be dependent on the periodization cycle or the periodization phase of your cycle that you're in. So what we're gonna do and how we're gonna determine that is first we're gonna determine your fat goal. And then once you determine your fat goal, the carb goal is going to fall into place because you already have your protein goal from yesterday, and then once you determine your fat goal, you're simply going to have the rest of your calories consist of carbohydrates. So if you read the email, there's sample calculations on how exactly to do that. I'm not gonna talk through that right now since I don't have the calculation in front of me, but if you read the email, you'll be able to find sample calculations of how exactly to do that math. It's very simple, it's not that difficult at all. So just refer to the email text to find some sample calculations. So during the in-season phase, we're gonna want you consuming roughly 25% of your calories from fat. This is gonna be enough to support proper hormonal health, manage inflammation, and support nervous system health, but it's also going to leave plenty of room for carbohydrates. Now, if your training volume is absolutely crazy and you're just running yourself into the ground essentially and you need some more carbohydrates to fuel yourself, but you don't want to go above in calories because you don't want to gain weight, what you can do is bring your fat down to 20%. I would not recommend taking your fat below 20% of your total daily intake because, again, you need it to maintain proper hormonal health and nervous system health and manage inflammation, which are all very important for your athletic performance. So you don't want to take fat too low because you're going to end up feeling like crap. So if you're within that 20 to 25% range during your in-season phase, you're gonna be in a good place. And then like we just talked about, once you determine that, you can do the math to figure out what your carbohydrate goal will be during your in-season phase. Typically, it will be very, very high, upwards of 300, 400, maybe even 500 plus grams. And I know it seems like a lot, but as a high-performing athlete, you gotta take in those carbohydrates to fuel that activity because like we talked about, they're your body's preferred source of fuel. So and in-season phase is dedicated for performance, so we need to make sure that you're fueling properly for that performance so you can perform when it really matters. So that's the in-season phase, fairly simple. And then moving into the post-season phase, what you're gonna do is take your fat intake actually up to 45 to 55% of your total daily intake. The reason why we do this is to restore optimal hormonal health, manage inflammation, manage inflammation, and restore like nervous system health, like we just talked about. Fat's super important and helpful for all of those things. So during the postseason phase, when training volume isn't high, you're resting, you're recovering, we're going to up the fat to facilitate more recovery so you're ready to dominate the off-season and the upcoming in-season phase. So to do that, we're gonna take fat up to 45 to 55%. It's a pretty high amount. And then this is also gonna help restore insulin sensitivity, which tends to be impaired when you take in such high amounts of carbohydrates on a regular basis like you are during the in-season phase. So the post-season phase is very helpful for recovering and restoring insulin sensitivity and all these things. So that's why we take the fat up to 45 to 55% of your total daily intake. And then just like with the in-season phase, once you have the fat goal, once you have your protein goal, the rest of your calories are going to come from carbohydrates. As fat goes up during the postseason phase, carbohydrates are likely going to come down quite a bit, and that's okay because you don't have the fuel needs that you do during the in-season phase. Ideally, during the postseason phase, you're either not training at all or just doing a very, very light workout and more recovery focused, so you don't need the carbohydrates as much to fuel the activity. Now, we're not going full keto, so you're not like super, super low carb, but it's going to be relatively low carb compared to what you're used to during the in-season phase. And the thing to realize, like we talked about, the postseason phase doesn't last all that long. So moving into the off-season phase, the goal for fat largely remains the same, whether your goal is performance, whether your goal is hypertrophy, whether your goal is fat loss. See, the fat goal for each of those scenarios is going to be relatively similar in that 25 to 30% range. And that's going to, again, leave enough room for carbohydrates to fuel performance, but also preserve hormonal health as well as possible and nervous system health and manage inflammation. And I wouldn't recommend going as low as 20% like during the in-season phase. There's really no need to do that during the off-season phase. Just get within that 25 to 30% range of your total daily intake for your fat intake, and you'll be in a good place. And as far as carbs, as always, they'll make up the rest of your calorie intake. And that will largely depend, where those carbs fall will depend on what your goal is, whether you're trying to put on muscle, just perform and get better at skills, or lose fat. That's going to determine where your carbohydrates fall for the off-season phase. And then lastly, preseason phase, same thing for the fat goal as the in-season phase. Because again, the goal of the preseason phase is to transition you back to that in-season focus. And over the course of those like 8 weeks or so, we're gonna get you back to that fat goal of 25 or so percent while ramping up the carbs. So once you determine that fat goal, and then you'll have the fat and the protein, and the rest of the calories during the preseason phase will be made up of carbohydrates. And as you increase the calories over the course of the preseason phase, the increase is likely going to come from carbohydrates. So we're going to have that baseline level of fat, and then the increase in calories is likely going to come from carbohydrates in most cases. Of course, there's always exceptions to the rule, but for the most part, the increase is going to come from carbohydrates. So that pretty much brings us to the end of this video. I cannot state enough how important carbohydrates are for your performance. If you're not eating enough carbs, you're simply not giving yourself enough fuel, and when you don't have enough fuel, you're not going to perform optimally. So we got to make sure that you're eating enough carbohydrates, especially during that in-season phase, especially during that off-season phase. And as you can see, there's context in which a low-carb approach is very helpful, and that's during the postseason phase. So low carb isn't inherently bad as an athlete. It just depends on the context of what periodization cycle you're in. That's the key. So hopefully this was helpful for you. As always, hit reply down below and let me know what you calculated for yourself for your carb and fat goals depending on what season you're in. So I can personally make sure that you are getting off to a great start when it comes to applying these principles. I want to make sure, the whole point of this ebook is to make sure that you're in a place to apply these principles. So hit reply down below, let me help you out, let me double check and make sure you're getting going on the right track. So again, thank you so much for watching this video. Thank you so much for following along this far into the course, and stay tuned tomorrow when we'll talk about a really overlooked topic when it comes to athletic performance, which is nutrient timing.